I will introduce the next session, which is entitled Clinical Trial of the Future. And it features two key leaders from our colleagues at Medidata who are making this future a reality. First, I'd like to introduce Andrea Falkoff, the Vice President of Product Management at Medidata. Andrea brings over 18 years of experience in the pharmaceutical and clinical development industries. She is an expert in managing imaging, life cycles, strategic focus on oncology and advanced imaging technologies. She is joined by Melissa Ceruolo, Medidata Vice President of Engineering and Biomarker Analytics. Melissa is an accomplished engineer, executive with a Master of Science from MIT. She specialized in biomarker analytics and the commercialization of innovative medical devices. Together, their presentation will look towards virtual twins of the human to predicting outcomes with real-time data and closed-loop system decisions. Please welcome on stage Andrea and Melissa.
Thank you, Nicolas. All right, thank you, Nicolas, for the awesome introduction. I'm very excited to be here today and appreciate everyone's attendance as well. So for those of you that don't know me, there are two things that I am extremely passionate about in my work. First is medical imaging. I've been working in the medical imaging space, like Nicolas said, over 18 years now. And when I first started in the space in 2005, I started as an imaging assistant working on clinical trials, helping to standardize medical imaging. And I kid you not, we were still receiving mostly hard copy films, and I was the person responsible for using a wax pencil to cross out patient information on that film. And we saw real huge innovation in the past 18 years across medical imaging, from moving to a digital platform to more standardization, to novel techniques, new imaging modalities like PET, as well as looking towards predictive outcomes, which is what we're going to focus on today for our presentation. The second thing I'm very passionate about, I've been saying this for years, is that data will change how we interact with patients in a healthcare setting. And this is also true for clinical trials. For those of us that may have experienced some form of health crisis, either ourselves or with a family member, sometimes we're left asking a lot of questions. Why didn't my doctor notice this sooner? Why wasn't this caught? What is my prognosis? What's my quality of life? And these are all questions that I firmly believe that virtual twins will be able to answer for us, really changing us from a reactive approach to healthcare to a more proactive approach to healthcare. Oops, I don't know what I did here. Sorry, hit the wrong button. So a little bit about Medidata. So Medidata has been providing technology to support clinical trial endpoint collection for over 25 years. At this point, we've supported over 36,000 clinical trials, and we collect over 70 billion data points annually. And of course, my baby medical imaging, we've now collected over 1 billion medical images across many therapeutic areas, including device, oncology, cardiac imaging, and other areas as well. And so Medidata is really well positioned to leverage this vast data set to create and offer virtual twins. So imagine now we have the pipeline to collect all of this data, and if we're able to layer on virtual twins, the value that we can create for sponsors as well as patients is very dramatic and really a game changer for the industry. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of virtual twins that exist today at Medidata. So one example is our external control arm offering, which uses historical trial patients to supplement or replace control arms on clinical trials. So I think we can all understand the benefits of this, making trials cheaper, getting things out to patients faster, but also for those trials where this is really a patient's last hope, ensuring that we have higher enrollment on investigational arm can be really, really beneficial for patients. The other example virtual twin we have is something that I have worked on along with Nicolas Pécuchet and his team. And one thing I want to point out is that during Patrick's presentation yesterday, he showed a lot of examples of how virtual twins will really impact patient care in the healthcare setting. But I want to say that these same virtual twins can absolutely be applied to clinical trials to offer a lot of the same benefits in predicting outcomes, predicting adverse events, and predicting success of either a device or a therapy. And so we'll talk about a few examples of that today, but this is one that is available now. So we were able to take the virtual twin for oncology, developed by Nicolas and his team for healthcare, and integrate it with my clinical trial imaging solution so that when CT scans are uploaded, we're able to automatically identify tumors on a CT scan and apply measurements. So you can see the value add. We're getting data and able to process it faster to really allow insights much faster than we could in the past. On top of that, we are also annotating in a 3D segmentation, looking at the volume data. And once we have that volume data, we're able to apply radiomic assessments. So this is something that we're looking towards for the future, is layering on radiomics, which can really allow us to look at things that you can't see with the naked eye. So this is another area of innovation that has really exploded in the past few years, is getting more out of your medical images beyond what a human eye can see. And so radiomics can look at the features of a tumor, and the theory is that we can use the features to predict tumor response and potentially even overall survival on these trials. So imagine that as we're collecting these images on these trials, being able to instantly predict response for patients, for our customers to make decisions faster and get these drugs out faster. I will say this algorithm, a little bit about the background of its development, which I find very interesting, is that we trained this algorithm on about 50,000 lesions available from a US public data set. But really the differentiator for us is we were able to augment that training data set with 50,000, more than 50,000 additional lesions from a global diverse data set at Medidata. So this really helped us develop a very robust model that can identify lesions according to RECIST criteria in the chest, abdomen, and pelvis. So it's not an organ-specific algorithm, so it's very, very powerful. Okay, so a little bit about virtual twins in the device world. So we had a few presentations today on devices and how simulations and virtual twins are being used in device design. So it was actually the presentation before ours was a great segue into our presentation. Device actually makes up most of the imaging trials that we do. I think it's about 70% of our imaging trials are device-related trials, followed by cardiology and oncology, also very large areas. I feel like device has been a little bit ahead of the game when it comes to applying virtual twins and simulation. They're already doing this today when it comes to designing their devices and being able to reduce or eliminate physical testing by running these simulations to assess device performance and look at failures to help design these devices faster and get them into clinical trials faster. And then we also saw a few examples of where we are using simulations to help physicians practice these procedures with specific devices as well. So the device industry, again, I think is a little bit further ahead of where we might be in the pharmaceutical world. And we'll talk about a few examples in both device and pharma where we think virtual twins will add additional value in the future. So I think we beat this one to death. You guys know what a digital twin is at this point, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But the point that I really wanted to make is, again, a lot of the concepts that you're hearing and benefits that you're hearing about virtual twins in healthcare will directly apply to clinical trials as well. In clinical trials, we are collecting vast amount of data, like I mentioned on the first slide. In addition to imaging, we are collecting clinical information, labs, sensors, which Melissa will touch on. And I see a future where we'll also be incorporating genetic data, lifestyle data, things that are not traditionally incorporated on a clinical trial. As it becomes easier to ingest and aggregate this data, we will see this applied to clinical trials as well to really help improve outcomes and also predict adverse events before they happen. There's a lot of examples of virtual twins that we've talked about today. Cardiology is an area that's very interesting for me, and I know there's been several presentations. If you want to learn more and see more examples, there's a great journal that I put here, a publication that I put here in the American Heart Association Journal that talks about very specific use cases in the cardiac space of virtual twins, and it's very detailed and talks about how they see this improving healthcare in the future, as well as incorporating things like sensors and genetic data that we don't necessarily incorporate to a large extent today. So I highly encourage folks to take a look at that paper. Okay, so how does this apply to clinical trials? I've talked about a few examples, but in the future, we see a world where adaptive trials and in silico trials will become the norm. From being able to take all of that data that we've collected historically and create a baseline, we'll be able to collect and use technology to analyze data that's coming in essentially in real time and enable our customers to execute trials faster and do simulations that they weren't able to do before. In addition, I also feel like even in the case where we still are enrolling patients onto a trial, we will see virtual twins playing a huge role in how we also monitor those patients to have a more personalized experience on trials. And so we'll be able to simulate how a patient may react to a certain therapy. We'll be able to predict how a certain device might perform in a specific patient of a certain age and profile. And so this is all things that we see becoming the norm in the next, I don't know, 10, 15 years or sooner. So let's talk about some very specific examples. There's a few areas in clinical trials that I think could benefit greatly from the incorporation of virtual twins. So patient enrollment today on a clinical trial involves doing some imaging scans, typically also collecting some clinical data, medical history labs, and essentially verifying inclusion-exclusion criteria to see if a patient's eligible. So pretty much a checklist of going through, does it make sense for me to enroll this patient? So where we see virtual twins playing a role is that once we have more data being incorporated on a clinical trial, so genetic data, sensors, omic data, we'll be able to actually simulate before we enroll the patient how this patient is going to perform. So think of a cardiac device. We'll be able to simulate, based on a patient's imaging and other data, how this patient is going to perform. Are they a good candidate for this trial, or is there a risk here? So in addition to having your inclusion-exclusion criteria, clinical trials of the future will also have a risk criteria that will be generated by these virtual twins to ensure that we are enrolling the best patients that we can on these trials. There's also examples that we'll see in the pharma world that'll point out, especially in oncology, we are seeing the advent, again, of predictive outcomes. So predicting based on tumor types and genetics and other information, do we think this patient is going to respond to this therapy? We see this a lot in cell therapy as well. So really being able to be proactive and make sure we're selecting the right patients is not only going to improve the trial and get these drugs out faster, but also improve the patient's experience. And then long-term, really where I see this going, and Patrick touched on this in his presentation yesterday as well, was the intersection of healthcare and clinical trials. I've heard from other conferences that other countries do see clinical trials as healthcare. They are one and the same. In the US, it's a little bit different. We kind of see them as two different things. But I think in the future, healthcare will move towards a world where we will have our virtual twin. It will update based on all the data that our physicians are collecting. And we'll be able to then provide the best possible match of treatment based on my specific lifestyle, my genetic profile, my family history, how active I am, and things like that, to determine, is the best treatment something that's commercially available, or is the best treatment something that's in a clinical trial? Maybe it's actually something that's in a clinical trial. And so this concept of patient matching, I think, is going to be where the future is going. And we saw a little bit of that in the My Medidata app, where it shows a patient matching scenario happening for healthcare. This could also apply to oncology, so I kind of have a device example with mitral valve replacement, where the type of mitral valve that is recommended for you and the type of treatment that you receive may depend on many factors, including age. So imagine a world where now we can actually run simulations to consider age-related changes. right? That's not something that we can do today, to be able to pick, again, the best device that should be required for a patient. And again, that can be in a clinical trial, or that can be something that's commercially available. And then as we look at oncology, in the oncology space, as a patient, if I'm diagnosed with cancer, I'm concerned about my survival profile, and I'm also concerned about my adverse events, my quality of life that I might experience on a therapy. So again, I see a world where we can actually simulate a patient, take their medical records, and actually simulate how they respond to specific treatments available commercially, but also available in clinical trials, and match them to a therapy that is going to give them the highest overall survival profile. So that's really where I see this going. I'm going to pass it now to Melissa to talk a little bit more about other aspects and also about how sensors will come into play.
Thanks, Andrea. So at Medidata, Andrea is clearly the imaging expert, and I'm the sensors gal. So I've been working on sensor technology and wearables for a very long time. And we've talked a lot today about the imaging and the MRI scan and what we can do with the information that we're getting in a clinic environment. And I want to talk a little bit about the equally valuable information that we're getting from the real world. So I know this is a little bit cliche, but raise your hand if you are wearing something that monitors your physiology, or you've worn something that monitors your physiology. So it's ubiquitous. So we're all wearing something, or have worn something where we're collecting motion data, we're collecting PPG data, heart rate data, and it's really untapped in terms of how we're bringing that information into this clinical ecosystem. And what we're seeing in the analysis of these signals is that we can learn so much about what's going on from a functional capacity, from a motion, from a behavior standpoint in the comfort of your own home by looking at a few days of data, 24 hours of data. We've actually done some studies, because oftentimes in a clinical study, the sponsors are asking, well, how long do we have to wear the device? Which device? How long do we have to wear it? Does it have to be 24/7? Does the patient need to be monitored for 365 days a year? And really the data is showing that that's really not the case. And so in certain studies, what we're finding, a data-driven approach to identify how much data is enough, and balancing the patient burden and kind of the data volume with the analytics component. So in one study that we did in Huntington's disease, where we're monitoring mobility and sway and symptoms like chorea, we're actually seeing that 3 days of continuous data is sufficient to capture the coefficient of variability across the different types of movement patterns. So that's a very powerful data point that we're using to influence the design of future studies that are interested in tapping into the signal that really is a very powerful and meaningful and a high value information, but that can be very predictive. When I was studying at MIT doing my master's thesis, this was 15 years ago, we were working with a group at the Center for Biomedical Innovation on adaptive licensing. And while I was there, the entire thesis was around applying system engineering principles to the practice of medicine and healthcare. And I think everyone understands the difference between waterfall approach and agile approach in software engineering. So think about the current standard of clinical trials. It's very waterfall. We go through the phase 1, phase 2, years, many millions of dollars later, and finally, a decade and lots of money later, we have a drug. We want to think about how we can really emphasize the adoption of this adaptive trial, adaptive licensing. And I think today is a really good time to reflect on all of the data and all of the simulations and all of the power at our fingertips that we can do now to help change and evolve the way that we are approving drugs and other therapeutics in the industry. The waterfall approach is not sustainable, and I think that right now we are sitting on a really interesting point in time where we have all the tooling to do better. So Andrea and I talked a little bit about, I didn't want to leave this presentation without some aspect of the engineering side and the infrastructure and the architecture needed to support all of the things that we're talking about. So we spent a lot of time today talking about what we're going to do and the vision of how we're going to be transformative. But we really need to understand the tooling and all of the steps that we need in order to develop the system. So in software engineering, we talk about the ilities of software engineering: scalability, interoperability, performance, flexibility, and predictability. And so along this spectrum from the source data to analytics, we need to be really strategic about how we architect our stack. We need to ensure that we are flexible enough that we can bring in multimodal data into our ecosystem, and we've been working on that for quite some time, looking at different device manufacturers and figuring out a way to interrogate their clouds and bring the data into our central cloud. And we also need to standardize the data to make it interoperable, so adding a layer of standardization and using open standards available so that we have consistency across the data set. And then something that my team is working on right now is the application of knowledge graphs. And what this does is it adds the semantic ontology to the data set to prime it for modeling and prime it for LLM performance and usage. And so that's that, really thinking about how it's going to perform and how we're going to meet those requirements around speed and performance. And the agents need to be specifically trained for the information, medical type of agents, clinical informatics agents that understand the data that we're throwing at them. And then finally, what I think Andrea and I are really passionate about is the predictive nature of the system, and really what we would love to see implemented in both clinical trials and in healthcare. So going back to my sensor expertise and why I'm so interested in digital endpoints, is because I really just truly see the value. I am in the weeds analyzing the data, and I'm also seeing reports like this one coming out of the Digital Medicine Society and Tufts and some other collaborators where they looked at thousands of clinical trials that use digital biomarkers, and they're reporting on not only the reduction in trial timelines, but also the increase in ROI. And it's pretty obvious, because if you have this information earlier, then you can pivot and make adjustments. The other thing about sensor data is that the data is has so much precision around it. So think about the more precise and the more voluminous is your data, the less data that you need, the less amount of patients, the less duration. And so it's really this is a powerful research article that came out, and we're looking forward to continue to provide that evidence to really drive the adoption. So this is my last slide, and this slide really resonated with me in terms of a visualization of where we are today and where we want to go. This is from a paper from Scientific America. And the first bar on the top represents kind of the current day reactive approach to managing health. In the United States alone, we spend $5 trillion on healthcare, and each individual is spending about $15,000 to $20,000, maybe $30,000 per family on healthcare. It's just not sustainable. We're very reactive. We wait until we see symptoms and clinical signs to do something about it. And you can see in the top chart how your reduced wellness over time is an impact of the process that we have today. Now, with all of this data that we have, well, it's our job to make use of this data and be smarter and more strategic about it. And when we sense that something, or we sense a risk score or a classification that is abnormal or not our baseline, we react then. We don't wait until the symptoms continue to evolve. We react sooner. We get that insight intervention sooner. And you can see here that with all of this knowledge, we have a better chance of being more proactive, personalized, predictive, and preventative. And essentially, we're hoping that this is going to impact not only clinical trials, but the healthcare system at large. So with that, we're happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Melissa. Is there any question from the audience? Yeah, we have one question.
Thank you, great presentation. I'm wondering at what point your assumptions about the ambient environment in which people live start to demand the same level of monitoring and censoring, considering modernity has a number of side effects, like drugs have side effects. So we're talking air, water, food, soil, mode. I mean, there's, in Germany, I know, building biology that is a context in order to talk about health on a daily basis.
I think that it's often overlooked. We are very blindsided in terms of what type of data we're bringing into our analysis, and we understand that some of the diseases are environmentally caused. And so I think that hopefully we can be a little bit more global thinking in terms of the ecosystem of data to really help to have a better understanding of disease and symptoms. It's still very early.
Yeah. One more question. This is Michael. You were talking about the different ways that you actually will predict particular patients for enrollment. One of the questions is how do you define that they will respond? Meaning, sometimes patients partially respond, and so would they get excluded? Because you want a good clinical trial, but from a patient standpoint, I might still want the therapy even though I only got a partial response. So response has to be defined very clearly in what you're expecting.
Yeah, 100%. And we see that even now with early models that are predicting response. Most sponsors are using it more for informational purposes and not necessarily using it to make decisions like, should I enroll this patient? But that's definitely where the industry wants to go, and I agree with you. We absolutely have to be careful about defining what we mean by predicting response when it comes to enrollment, because you're right, there are patients that will want to be on these trials. But at the same time, I think these models will become so advanced that we will have a lot more confidence in what response means, how accurate the response is, and having data to back that up as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And nice presentation.